This is Metro Week. Our top story, the mental health care system in southern Arizona. We'll interview the chief of the new company managing behavioral health here. Then our journalists roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. All of the public mental health providers in southern Arizona are managed by a single company, and the system is in transition right now. We'll start with a look at the new company managing that care. Simpatico Integrated Care took over the mental health system in southern Arizona in October. The community partnership of southern Arizona managed mental health care here before that. The state hires companies to provide these services in each county, and Simpatico is now running the behavioral health system in 8 southern Arizona counties. 2 other companies manage the rest of the state. Simpatico is known as the Southern Arizona REBA, or Regional Behavioral Health Authority. It contracts with service providers to get health care to patients. Essentially, it works like an HMO health care plan to manage the health services for every patient. When Simpatico took over, it set 8 main goals to achieve its 3-year contract. The state has the option to renew the contract for up to 4 more years after that, which is why many of these goals are for 7 years. One of the most prominent of Simpatico's goals is to integrate patients' mental health care with their physical health care, and that's the basis for a lot of the goals that hang on the office walls. The last time we spoke to Terry Stevens, Simpatico's CEO, the company had not yet started managing mental health care here. It was still preparing to take on that role. Now, she says, she's focused on making changes. Terry, what changes did Simpatico make when it took over the behavioral health system in southern Arizona 5 months ago?
Well, we established an office here in Tucson, and we hired well over 250 new employees so that we could do the big job that we had promised to do. And we contracted with a number of the behavioral health providers as well as physical health providers here in the Tucson area, so that the members would be able to see the providers that they've always known and have worked with. So the very first thing you do when you win a contract of this size, besides gear up for it, is to make sure that you provide a safety net for the folks, and also to make sure that all the folks that they've been seeing are under contract or can see the individuals so they get the services they need. So the first 5 months, you really just try to make sure that everybody is getting services. And then you start to make changes and improvements.
And from a patient perspective, would a patient have noticed any changes in that time?
They might have. There were some glitches always with a changeover, and some of the providers weren't familiar with Simpatico Integrated Care. So they got confused sometimes about what the physical health and the behavioral health together was. So there were a number of calls. We actually had additional customer service during that time, so people could call in and get answers to the questions that they had. So that we hope that most people didn't experience much changes, but there probably were some along the way.
I actually received some calls or emails from patients who were worried about whether their doctor would stay in the system or who had found out that they weren't. They were confused about whether some of their services would remain covered. And I just wondered if you could tell me about what's at the top of your priority list in terms of what you're hearing from patients and patient response.
Well, in the last couple of months, when we've done our focus groups, we're starting to hear that they're starting to see an improvement in what's happening rather than the things that we heard early on. There were a number of physical health providers that weren't sure whether they wanted to contract with us initially. So that did create some anxiety for members, but we do have a year to work on that so that we do pay them even though they're not contracted for the first year. So we have been hurriedly working with those providers to make sure that they're on contract. I think most are at this point. There's still a few who are kind of holdouts and don't want to contract with a behavioral health company for physical health needs. But we continue to talk to them about the fact that they've been actually serving our members for a very long time, and that we really expect for them to not drop their members just because we happen to be a different company. So we hope to get through this, and we seem to be making a lot of progress. We have very few PCPs or specialists at this point who have refused to sign a contract. There are some still in process, but mostly everybody has agreed to join our network.
You've referenced this, and Simpatico added 2 words to its name. Now it's Simpatico Integrated Care, and you've mentioned whole health and integrated care so far. Explain Simpatico's approach to integrated care and what that means to a patient for a company that's overseeing behavioral health.
Well, what we're looking for is actually creating what we call health homes for members with SMI diagnosis.
That's severely mentally ill.
Severely mentally ill, yes. And what we're looking at is to make sure that we're coordinating care and actually increasing the likelihood that folks will get the services that they need. A lot of folks that have an SMI diagnosis or a serious mental illness don't get the services that they need and, in fact, die younger than the average population, in fact, 30 years younger. So we've really been working on how do we make sure that they get the services that they need, make sure that they're not traumatized in the services that they go, because oftentimes folks don't understand what it is to have a mental illness and what kind of things led up to where they have the kind of symptoms that they have today. So trauma is a huge piece of what we need to make sure we sensitize our providers to and make sure that our members don't experience additional trauma.
So what you're referencing is, say, when someone goes to their physician, their general care, or their dentist, that those providers have an understanding of how to work with someone who has a mental illness?
That's correct. So there's a lot of education going on. There's a lot of information sharing going on. We make sure that the behavioral health home actually works with that physical health provider so that the case manager helps educate, goes with, so that we're coordinating care very directly. But a lot of our behavioral health clinics have put in physical health clinics in them. And those are the ones that I'm most interested at this point as to how well they're going to work. Because I really do think that this is a place where the folks that have a serious mental illness feel most comfortable and are more likely to come on a regular basis to get their preventative care, to engage in an exercise program, to start going to a stop smoking type of education program. So we're really looking at how do we identify what all the physical health as well as the behavioral health issues are of the members and make sure that we're putting a treatment plan together that covers all of those so that as you look at, not one will be left out or not being addressed.
How will you know when you've reached those goals?
Well, we do a lot through claims. You know, in terms of seeing, are they actually getting those services? As we send alerts out, because let's say they need a well woman check, we'll send an alert out to their recovery coach, and then we'll see whether that well woman check has actually come in a claim form to kind of check off. So we'll be looking at percentages overall as to how folks are doing. We'll actually be incentivizing those behavioral health agencies to actually follow through and make sure that their members get these type of services. For example, a few months ago, we actually incentivized all the behavioral health recovery coaches to help their members get flu shots because it was really important. A lot of our members have respiratory illnesses. To not have a flu shot is irresponsible. So we made sure that they knew, and we kept track, and we actually incentivized based on the claims as they came in to show that that member actually got a flu shot.
And you have a partnership with Banner University Medical Center.
We do.
Also on this whole healthcare approach,
We
correct?
do.
Can you explain how that works?
They decided that they'd like to do one starting from the physical health side, and they, of course, have a behavioral health arm of their division. So they pulled their team together, and they've created an integrated health clinic as well, so that we will have a number of different choices that folks can have as to what kind of behavioral health or physical health medical home they want to have. So we really are looking at technology to help us with this. We have what we call a provider portal that sends out daily information to the clinics to make sure that they know what's happening. For example, if their member was at the emergency room last night, whether they were interacted with a crisis mobile team last night, so that they can follow up and we can make sure that folks are getting the services and the follow-up they need.
You're 5 months into this contract. What's next on the horizon?
Well, we start to make the changes that we hope that will have an impact on the community. We did actually build out the crisis system pretty substantially in the first 5 months. That was the only thing that I wanted to actually build during the startup. But in the months to come, we're working on kind of increasing what we call wraparound services, brief intervention programs, looking at how we build out our jail interactions. We've actually done quite a lot of work on that already. But we, hired an entire justice-involved individual team to work on that because we really want our individuals not to be in jail. That's not where you get the best treatment. Although the jail does a pretty good job, it isn't where they need to be. We need to have them in our clinics, and they need to be getting the services they need, and we need to help them not get to the spot where they interact so often with our police in the community.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, a conversation about privacy featuring Edward Snowden speaking from Russia.
We have a government that seems to be almost completely unrestrained by law or the Constitution.
Now our Journalists Roundtable. Joining me in the studio today are Emily Bregel of the Arizona Daily Star and two of my colleagues, Gisela Tellis and Christopher Conover from Arizona Public Media. Gisela, I want to start by just asking you to weigh in on how the changeover has gone. What are you hearing from other organizations and people about how this switch has been?
So in her interview with you, Terry mentioned that they're still ironing out the kinks, and that's what I've heard from providers and patient advocates alike, that they're seeing a mix of potential improvements and potential pitfalls in these first few months. One mental health advocate I talked to who works in a very rural area with very limited services told me that so far she feels that Simpatico is very receptive to their needs, and that wasn't always her experience there, and that they're actively working together to get much needed services there, even for children, and that's an underserved population in Arizona. At the same time, though, she's working with families who've had issues with the Simpatico's grievance process already, so I think that they're still sorting out the customer service end.
I find that really interesting that you mentioned the rural health perspective on this, because as we mentioned, Simpatico is managing healthcare in 8 counties, and so Pima is obviously, or the Tucson area of Pima is highly densely populated, but pretty much all the other counties are widespread, and healthcare can tend to be a problem in those areas. Have you heard about doctors specifically trying to work with Simpatico? Anything on that end?
The doctors and organizations that are contracted with Simpatico I talk to are very concerned about the transition. They're concerned about how it's going to impact how they're paid and how they do their work. One, obviously the funding is a major concern, and some organizations have said they are already seeing funding cuts. But one issue that came up over and over again is Simpatico's focus on tracking performance. So they're very interested in counting claims, keeping track, making sure that patients are getting the services that they need, and that the outcomes are good, and then incentivizing organizations if they perform well. And a lot of the doctors and organizations I talk to are concerned about how that will play out in practice. So is counting claims or making sure that they've been filed the best way to make sure that patients are getting good quality services? Is that a good rubric for the quality of the care? Is a question that I think is still unresolved.
And that's potentially because it's still so new. We're still in transition with all of this.
It is new, although it's interesting to point out that a lot of it is already underway. So some of the clinicians I talk to are already, they're already seeing more frequent audits of their claims. They're getting more communication from Simpatico about things, billing codes not matching up and things like that. And they're already having to more frequently and more extensively report on what they're doing. So they're having to take a lot more time for documentation of what they do.
And how about you, Emily? What have you learned in your reporting about this?
A lot of similar themes as Gisela, actually. I've spoken to a lot of leaders of behavioral health agencies that contract with Simpatico, and it's been a difficult transition. Pretty much all of them agree, with varying degrees of optimism. Many are really optimistic that these changes will improve their performance, other agencies' performances. At the same time, it is a big change because Simpatico is very different than CPSA, the previous Ariba. Simpatico is a for-profit, a subsidiary of a publicly traded company based in St. Louis, versus CPSA is a local company, nonprofit, that was basically designed by the provider community here. So understandably, it's shaken a lot of things up, and the data-driven reporting requirements that Terry and Gisela spoke about, that is creating a lot of extra work and a lot of pressure on these agencies. They're having to meet quotas in order to get paid for the month. They get paid in month block payments. And some of the bigger agencies can handle not getting paid for a month or two, but smaller agencies, many have said that some of these agencies won't survive this transition. And at the same time, even I spoke with Clark Romans of NAMI of Southern Arizona, and his agency saw reimbursement rate cuts of about 2/3. And he is yet still optimistic, though. He says if Simpatico is able to actually implement these ambitious goals they have, that would improve care for the people in this area. So he's feeling cautiously optimistic.
On that varying degrees of optimism, do they feel that with that reporting, the new reporting requirements and this focus on data, that actually could end up helping them, or is that still up in the air?
Yeah, I think there's this idea that when you really look at outcomes, patient outcomes, and then begin to incentivize improvement by tying reimbursements to those performance measures, which is, I think, going to be phased in over time. The idea is that will just help improve quality. I think a lot of providers would also argue against that, and that let us, give us the goals, give us the funding, and let us do what we know how to do. There is definitely this sense among some that they're being a little overmanaged by Simpatico. So there's really both sides there, both opinions on it.
Right. And Gisela, I want to touch on something that we almost breezed over in the interview earlier, and that's the concept of integrating care. I mean, we did talk about it, but not a lot. And it's important enough that Simpatico changed its name to Simpatico Integrated Care. What is integrated care? What does that mean?
So it's integrated care is very, very important. So it's basically bringing together your physical health care, so your regular annual checkup and your dentist visit and all those things, with your mental health care. And the reason this is important is because we are all both things. So there is a mind-body link, and one thing affects the other. And regardless of whether you have a mental illness or you don't, your outlook on the world, the way you feel, is going to affect your physical health. Having good nutrition, getting exercise, good physical care can improve your mental health. And likewise, the lack of those things can worsen your mental health. So it's important to tie these things together. And the research bears out that this is especially important with people who are living with mental health disorders. Because as Terry mentioned, there's a huge life expectancy gap. So people who are living with mental health disorders die 25 to 32 years younger. And I think that when we hear about this gap, we often think about suicide as the reason behind it. But actually, most of these people are dying of heart disease, cancer, all the usual leading causes of death in the U.S. The problem is that they're sicker at earlier ages, and there are multiple reasons for that researchers are still piecing together. There's the issue of a lot of the medications that are used to manage these conditions have serious physical side effects that can impair your health. There is the stress and isolation that comes with living with a mental illness that we know from the research actually has a toll on everyone's physical health. And there are other issues. So there's sort of lifestyle things, like people who are living with mental illness tend to smoke more. There's often comorbidity with substance use disorders, and all of these things are not optimal for good health. And what's really interesting is that with the latest research, we're seeing that there are also biological connections between these things. So for example, You have depression and heart disease. And researchers have found that having one makes you more likely to develop the other, regardless of the one you start with. So they think that there is this underpinning that's related to how our immune system functions and our inflammatory response that could actually trigger both conditions. So these things are very closely intertwined, and the implications are very serious if you have a serious mental illness.
Now, Terry mentioned that she had the perception that some people who have mental health providers are more comfortable getting, say, a flu shot at that kind of a location. Does that square with what you've heard?
It depends. So I think I can see why she made that point, because I think folks who've been living with a diagnosis for a long time, have an established relationship with their behavioral health provider, do feel, and a lot of the folks I've talked to do feel comfortable there. They would be more likely to get a flu shot, get a checkup there. But there's another potential benefit of having integrated health homes that Terry didn't touch on, and it's that people who've never sought mental health treatment, because of the stigma associated with it, the stigma associated with mental illness is so much greater than that for physical illness. So folks who haven't gotten help because of the stigma, because they're concerned about how their family members or their community will respond, how they'll be labeled after that point, might be more likely to seek out help if they're in an integrated health home where all those services are together, because you can go in there and you can get mental health treatment and no one will know whether you're seeing your psychiatrist or picking up allergy medicine from your family doctor. And so that can help people to feel safe, and that might actually lead people to seek out help and to stick with it for longer.
I feel like we've mostly talked about mental health and behavioral health in the context of adults. But Emily, I know you're working on a story about kids. Can you tell us what you're working on?
Yes, my story that will be in our Sunday paper is looking at when it's appropriate to place a child in level 1 residential treatment centers. So these are highly restrictive centers that are staffed by medical professionals. They're locked down, kids go to school on site, and in the past they have been overutilized. That's something a lot of experts agree on. It's not the ideal placement for a child, and Terry Stevens of Simpatico has been really vocal about her opposition to these centers and how it is much better in the vast majority of cases to do these wraparound 24-hour support services for families or a foster family to keep the child in their community. But at the same time, experts do agree that there are cases where this restrictive placement is the best placement for a child's safety if they're a danger to themselves or others. And there is concern that now the Simpatico has closed down Devereaux's 10-bed residential treatment center here in Tucson. So we don't have one in Tucson anymore. So that means if a child does need one, they're going to be going out of county. Okay. So there's some concern about that decision. And I did speak to a family who's very worried about their son. They really believe he requires this level of care, and they just can't get approval for it. So it's a complicated issue.
And what's interesting is the state has started to recognize the need for mental health, especially for foster kids that are being pulled out of homes by DCS. The governor signed a bill earlier this year that went into law right away that requires kids that get pulled out of homes for whatever reason receive some sort of mental health check-in, if you will, within 72 hours of being pulled out, and in some cases, depending on the circumstances, within 2 or 3 hours for some very severe circumstances. It also made it easier for foster parents to directly contact mental health providers and not have to go to the state caseworker first, so that if a foster parent recognizes that one of the kids in their care is having a problem, they don't have to go through the bureaucracy. They can start getting them treatment right away.
And mostly for like an emergency, that would be
These are emergencies, or again, if a foster parent, maybe they've had a child for a while, or maybe they're very, very attuned to the child that was just brought to them. They see something going on and they want to stop it before it becomes a larger problem, and help these kids through the situations they're going through, or an emergency situation also. Exactly.
This is obviously a really important topic, but I do want to switch to some of the politics of the week, just to cover more ground a little bit. And Christopher, one of the things that you've been looking at is campaign finance reform, and specifically dark money. So let's start with, what is dark money?
It's complicated. We hear terms, especially now that we're in a big campaign year, between like dark money and super PACs. Both of those groups can give unlimited money to campaigns. The difference comes in how they're regulated. Super PACs report to the Federal Election Commission, which means all of the money they get and all of the money they spend must be reported, where they spend it and who they get it from. Dark money doesn't go through the FEC, it goes to the IRS, and these are usually nonprofit organizations that fall under the 501c tax code. We always think of 501c3s as charities. These fall under their very often 501c4s, a little different section of the tax code. They don't have to report who gives them money, nor do they really heavily report who they give money to. Now we know who they give money to because out income, we do see that, but we don't see where their money comes. So it's a good way if you want to give money and a large amount of money to a candidate or a campaign, but you don't want your name out there, you go through one of these, what are now called dark money organizations.
And have there been proposals to change how those are managed, regulated?
In Arizona, they're going to be regulated differently. The governor just signed a bill that Arizona will no longer regulate dark money organizations. It will now go only under the federal government, which means only the IRS is regulating. There was a big rewrite of campaign finance laws in Arizona, and that was one of the parts of it. The law does a lot of other things, but that was the part that raised the most questions. Backers of it said it was actually a freedom of speech issue because political donations have been defined by some courts as speech. And if you know who I'm giving to, it might chill my free speech. I might not want you to know who I'm giving to. Therefore, this is a free speech issue was the argument. Opponents say, well, transparency is more important than free speech. It now goes to buying elections and things like that.
Every year the state legislature seems to consider bills that would change campaign finance laws in one way or another. What else is kind of still outstanding in the proposals at this point?
This bill was kind of an omnibus bill, as those of us who watch the legislature call it. It covered a lot of things. Included in it were changes to if you want to throw a fundraiser for somebody. If you were running for office and I decide to throw a fundraiser for you, I no longer have to worry about how much I'm giving you to spend on food and things like that. That's open. A lot of people criticize that because that's where we had trouble with the Fiesta Bowl a number of years ago, buying things for state lawmakers. That was illegal. Now a lot of that would not be illegal. There's also what's in this bill called the Kingmaker provision, which allows candidates to give other candidates money from their own campaign accounts. Arizona allowed this in the 80s and then took it away because it gave a lot of power, especially to officers of the legislature. The House Speaker could say to a member, you know, I really like to see you back and I need your help on something. Here's $2,000 for your campaign or whatever it is. So that is back. That may go away before the end of the session, though.
That bridges into concerns about buying votes, buying favorability, all kinds of potential conflict of interest, stuff like that. Okay.
And that may go away. There is talk of amending another bill to get rid of that. Republicans and Democrats had a little heartburn over that issue.
I want to touch on the U of A as our final topic. We're running short on time. First of all, tuition is going up again. That's something we talk about annually. The Board of Regents is in town this weekend and they just took that vote. Why is tuition going up again though?
Tuition's going up because the money that the state gives to the universities still is lower than it has been in the past, and costs are going up at the universities. We all notice that in our lives. You know, the costs of day-to-day operation of a large facility like this is getting more expensive, so that has to be offset somewhere, and if less state money is coming in, that money has to come from somewhere. Now tuition is going up, but we have these guaranteed tuition plans now, so incoming freshmen last year are guaranteed through 4 years, so their tuition won't go up. It's the new students coming in who will see the
and then
increase.
finally, I'm going to cut you off a little. The big topic of the week regarding the U of A was a call by 22 state lawmakers for the president to resign from her position. Really quick wrap up what that was about.
The president of the university has accepted a position on the DeVry board, and that's a private for-profit institution, and they feel that that's a conflict. Ann Weaver Hart has said she checked it with the Board of Regents. It's fine. She's doing it on her own time, so it's not cutting into university business, and she's going to keep that position.
All right, we'll see how that develops. The regents are meeting this week, and there was no conversation about the president's future. So, so her contract stands, and she said she's not going to resign. She did tell Arizona Public Media that she has no intention to. So, that's where that story ends up this week. That's our show, but there's always more to talk about. Next week, we'll look into the future supply of water here in the Southwest. In the meantime, you can always find all of our stories online. Thanks for watching.